O Índice Global de Inovação é a principal referência sobre sistemas de inovação mundo afora, dando suporte aos tomadores de decisão. Sob o olhar do GII, vamos agora ouvir sobre duas das economias mais vibrantes do maior continente do mundo, a China e a Índia. Quem vem ao palco é Soumitra Dutta, co-editor do Índice Global de Inovação, ex-reitor e professor da S.C. Johnson College of Business da Universidade Cornell, e Carsten Fink, economista-chefe da Organização Mundial de Propriedade Intelectual. Sejam bem-vindos, um ótimo painel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Soumitra Dutta, and I'm a professor at Cornell. I'm also the co-editor of the Global Innovation Index. Along with Carsten, my colleague, we will talk a little bit about the index and how India and China are performing in the index, and how can Brazil perhaps compare or have a few lessons from those two countries. Many of you, when you entered this wonderful Congress, you saw this very nice globe out there, giving some ranks to countries and mentioning the most innovative countries around the world. Those ranks were coming from a piece of research called the Global Innovation Index. And in this index, we in fact cover more than 120 countries around the world. And we try to ask the question, how are these countries performing on both the inputs, the factors that enable innovation, and also on the outputs, the actual results of the innovation? And what can these countries learn from each other? Now, I'm very pleased that CNI SEBRAE is a partner in this research. That's the reason why you see the logo at the bottom right of CNI and SEBRAE. So this is something that we have a very strong link to Brazil through this research. The Global Innovation Index research is in its 11th year of publication right now. And essentially what we try to do is assess, beyond the simple traditional metrics, a holistic view of innovation happening in nations around the world. We also try to pick a theme each year. The theme chosen last year was innovation in energy. The theme chosen this year for the Innovation Index research for 2019 is innovation in health. Now, I will speak briefly about the Innovation Index. I talked a little bit about India. My colleague and co-panel presenter, Carsten, will talk a little bit more about innovation clusters and about China in particular, with a few references to Brazil. So how do we even think about innovation? If you want to measure something, you need to have some model or some framework about what does it mean to be innovative. After a lot of thought, a lot of consultation with experts, the Global Innovation Index uses this model to compute innovation in countries. Leaving aside the minute details, the big picture is as follows. There's a basic assumption in the Global Innovation Index, which is that everyone can innovate. Innovation is not the privilege of the few, but in fact the capacity and the ability of the many. So yes, large companies can innovate, but so can small businesses. Yes, PhDs and people with advanced education can innovate, so can people without formal degrees and often in the informal sector. So we try to capture the holistic nature of innovation in a country, and we do this through 5 input pillars And those are the 5 you see at the top. Elements around institution, the human capital, the markets, infrastructure, the business sophistication, and elements which are further detailed in sub-elements of those pillars. In terms of outputs, we look at 2 different output pillars, the knowledge and technology outputs and the creative services sector. Now, there's a lot of detailed mathematics behind the rankings. I will not go through them. If you're interested, please do go to the website, globalinnovationindex.org. So it's one word, globalinnovationindex.org. You can download the report, download the data, you can look at all the different elements as much as you'd like. But I think what we try and do is we compute the rankings of nations on the input pillars, which is the input in sub-index. We compute the rankings on the output 2 pillars, the output sub-index, and we combine the 2 to create an overall measure of innovation ranking for a country. So, what do the innovation countries look like today? So, if you look at the dark shaded column on the right, that is the overall ranking in 2018. So released last summer, this is the Global Innovation Index ranking of the most innovative countries, and you see a mix of countries out there across Europe, North America, and Asia. You, of course, can go in much more detail and look at the entire list of 120, but at the very first glance, you see that innovation today is a global game. Innovation is not just only happening in one geography, but in fact, innovation is happening across the world. And so any country, any company needs to have a global perspective on innovation. Carsten later will talk about China, which is doing extremely highly well rated on that list. It is not there in the first 10, but it is soon after that, as Carsten mentioned later. In the case of India and Brazil, India is ranked 57 and Brazil is ranked 67th. If you try to take a different picture comparing India, Brazil, US, and other countries, you can in fact plot the GII ranking along the GDP per capita. And you can actually compare for the same wealth level, GDP per capita, how are different countries performing. So if you look at that spline curve, the countries that are performing much higher than the curve are the ones that are doing better than their peers at the same income per capita levels. The countries that are at a lower level beyond the curve are performing at an inferior level to the level of development compared to the peers. If you look at those 3 countries or 4 countries highlighted out there, the size, of course, refers to population. You see India, China, and US outperforming their peers at the same income levels. Brazil is, of course, richer than India and less rich than China on a per capita basis, but Brazil is closer to the spline curve. So Brazil is above the curve, but it is performing at a level at what you'd expect for similar countries at that income per capita level. So very quick, let's say, simple impression of how these 4 countries compare. Now, I will spend a few minutes just talk about India, partly because this is a country that I come from originally, but also because it's a country which is a large country like Brazil, and which also has made innovation a priority for its future. Now, there are different ways to talk about innovation in India, and clearly I could talk about the IT sector, I could talk about a variety of other elements of education, performance in India, and so on. But I have chosen to focus on one simple area, which I think is very interesting, and at the same time perhaps may not be fully well known to everyone in the audience out here. And that is, how is India responding to the wave of digital disruption that is happening around us in the world? If you talk to people in India, they will often mention this acronym JAM, J-A-M. And this is really the three pillars underlying India's strategy for responding to the digital disruption happening around us. So what does J stand for? J stands for an inclusive finance policy of the central government, in which the government has opened bank balances for any poor person in the country. In fact, in the last 3 years, they have opened these bank accounts for almost 400 million Indians. These bank accounts can be opened with a zero balance. They have a number of special features like some limited overdraft, some insurance policies built into the bank balance, and of course certain maximum cap, because at a certain maximum level the bank migrates them to a regular bank account. But this element has opened the world of banking to 400 million people who did not have bank accounts before. So financial inclusion is a very important part of that Jan Dhan, J scheme. The centerpiece, Aadhaar A, is the biometric database which India has built over the last 6 years. This has received a lot of wide publicity in the world because this is the first and the most extensive biometric identity database built in the world. And today this database has about 1.2 billion citizens or residents of India who are actually in the database. And the last one really is mobile phones, mobile telephony, which is very common in many countries, including Brazil. But mobile phones are actually now getting a big push in India, and today there are almost 700 million people in India with mobile phones. Now, if you think of this central piece, the biometric database, many countries have identities of various kinds. You have a tax number, you have a passport number, other kinds of numbers, a health number perhaps. Now, what India has done is built one common unique identifier with associated biometric information, retina scans, fingerprints, and other kind of information. Now, I spoke to the people who designed the system, and they tell me that they took the inspiration from the GPS system. If you look at the GPS system, what happened was the government in the US designed the GPS system, which gives you just the location. It doesn't tell you anything else. It doesn't tell you what to do with the location. It gives you the location. And then it is up to the individual business or person to use the location information to do something. Deliver a pizza, find the shortest route to a path, or whatever. But GPS gives you a clean location information. So what Aadhaar does really in the Indian context, it gives a clean identity information. It doesn't tell you about health, doesn't tell you about finance, and there is no associated information out there. It's just a clean identity information. Now what happens as a result of this is you can actually change the way the lives of people are getting transformed right now. That biometric database is at the center, the heart of the system. And around that, what India is doing right now is building what is called the India Stack. India Stack is a stack of APIs, or just some interfaces to this biometric database that different companies can use to access information and do something with it. So let's take the simple example of the lady in the middle who's selling something on the street. If this person wants to get a small intraday loan to help her business, a loan for a few dollars just to be able to sell a few more items for the day. In the current system, or at least the system before Aadhaar, it would be impossible for her to get a loan. The cost of business, the cost of identity verification, the cost of access would be just simply too high. The inner circle really represents the different steps she would have to go through. She would have to access some kind of lender information, give information to the lender, choose among the different possible lenders, get the money transferred to her, sell, transact, and at the end of the day, give money, information, money back to the lender. All this would be too complex, too costly for her to get any credit. Today with the Aadhaar system, what has happened is there's a whole group of applications built out there which allows her to be able to identify herself very easily to an app that links various financial providers. Through an interface called the Universal Payment Interface, a variety of providers are linked into it. She can in fact choose across different possible sources of funds, make a choice, get the payment transferred automatically to her on a mobile device or some other electronic device, conduct the transactions as part of normal daily routine, and pay back the money at the end of the day to the lender. Now all this is possible because of this India stack, which has, besides the central identity information, today a whole sort of additional services like e-signing of documents, a digital locker where documents can be stored, a whole set of interfaces for specific sectors. Finance is the one which is most well developed. Health is coming up now. Tourism, education are planned in the near future. So what is happening right now is there's a digitization of the entire economy that is happening based on the platform. Now, how is this different from what happens, let's say, in America or China, which really is the home of the biggest internet-based digital leaders? Today, Alibaba, Amazon, Facebook, they all have their walled gardens. They all control the identities of their own customers or their own, let's say, people in the community. And it is almost impossible to have that kind of free transfer across different players because of these walled gardens. The internet is getting fragmented. But what India has done, India does not have Alibaba, India does not have a Facebook. So what India has done is created this common platform on which, very much like Lego bricks, you take Lego bricks, individual businesses are allowed to in fact innovate and digitize and enter the digital economy. So it's a very different model of digitization, one that does not depend on large digital companies. And this model is being now looked at very carefully because most countries besides US and China don't have these large digital companies. So they're looking at this very carefully, and ultimately as all these transactions get digitized, what is happening, which is very critical, is the amount of data richness in the country is increasing. To really be a player in the digital space, you need data. If transactions, processes are happening in paper-based legacy formats, you can't really capture the data and use the data. As you have all these Aadhaar-based applications, the India stack happening, the entire country is becoming more data rich, and that will in fact enable the country to enter in digital space in a much more effective manner. Just wanted to share with you one simple example of how India has managed digital space. I hand over the floor now to Carsten.
Thank you very much, Soumitra. Good afternoon to you all. Let me first of all thank Soumitra for having been our partner in the Global Innovation Index for close to a decade now. Soumitra is really the founder of the GII, and we joined forces with him once we recognized, this is really a successful endeavor. Let me also thank CNI and SEBRAE, who have been our collaborators on the Global Innovation Index, but let me also thank them for the broader cooperation with the World Intellectual Property Organization on a lot of intellectual property matters. Let me try to continue on Soumitra's presentation and say a few words about China in the Global Innovation Index. I'm usually the first one, whenever we come out with a Global Innovation Index, to caution policymakers, who immediately look, well, where does my country stand this year compared to last year? These year-on-year rankings have to be read with due caution. There are lots of factors that go into the GII. Sometimes we also change the methodology a bit, data availability changes. So the fact, that one country may go up or down in the ranking, is something that one, has to treat with some caution. Now, the story about China, though, is that China has consistently improved in the Global Innovation Index for the last at least 5 years. And it is now the only middle-income country that ranks among the top 30. It ranked 17th in 2018. And China is the country where we really have seen a consistent long-term improvement across the board in most of the indicators that make up the Global Innovation Index. So I plot here China's expenditure on research and development. So we have GERD and BIRD, which are the main R&D indicators as a percent of GDP. And you see, how China over the last, it's plotted here over the last 20 years, but you could go back further in history, how China, has, consistently increased its spending on research and development. And you would find, similar increases in other indicators. Here you see the number of researchers, you see R&D expenditure, you see patent filings, and on a lot of these indicators, China these days is among the top. Now, of course, in the Global Innovation Index, we normalize these indicators by the size of the country. But still, it is remarkable how China has improved its performance across the board. Now, I think it's then an obvious question to ask, well, first of all, how do we explain that? And secondly, what are the lessons to be drawn from that? And is there anything that we can learn that might help other countries as well? And I think that's where it gets more challenging. I certainly, I've been to China many times. We spent a great deal looking at figures from China, but I think I'm far from, being an expert on China or understanding, an economy in a country that, of course, is huge and highly complex. I would say if there are two things, that I would highlight in the case of China, it's first of all that China is quite unique in, having had a huge savings pool that has allowed, investments in the Chinese economy across the board, not only in infrastructure, but also in, various aspects that make up the innovation system. And I think that is one, key explanation. You have had an economy that, in the 2000s grew at an average rate of 10%. Growth has come down since then, but it's still above 5%. And that has generated a tremendous savings pool, and part of that was invested in the innovation system. I think the second thing to highlight about China is the commitment of policymakers to innovation. And that really goes back. You can look up the Chinese plans of the 1990s, and there were clear targets, clear goals of how especially the science and technology system should develop, and policymakers stuck to that. And that's maybe the one lesson about China that I would highlight as something that other countries can take something away from, which is that to be successful at innovation really requires perseverance. It requires a long-term commitment from all the stakeholders involved in the innovation system to have that innovation ecosystem grow, and to accept failures, to learn the right lessons from these failures, and to keep going. Just a few words about Brazil, and this is mainly to highlight that the Global Innovation Index, of course, goes beyond these aggregate rankings. We are trying to be as transparent as possible in the GII. We have a lot of information on individual countries. We have country portfolios in the GII. where in particular you can look at the relative strengths and weaknesses of countries. I listed the strengths and weaknesses of Brazil here. It's important to point out that these are all relative to other countries, so by definition every country has some strengths and weakness. Even the first-ranked economy, Switzerland, has strengths and weaknesses. In the case of Brazil, there's some clear strength, for example, in the education system. Also I think there is a quite developed R&D infrastructure. I think the main weaknesses you would find in the area of the business environment, ease of starting a business, credit availability. Also, there's still a relatively high tariff rate, which makes Brazil relatively closed. I'm sure for you to look at these strengths and weaknesses is probably more meaningful than for me, because you know the local context well. But I think that's one of the useful things about the GI. It really gives you this bird-eye look of the innovation system and how an economy stands, on these various indicators compared to others. Let me end by talking about an innovation in the Global Innovation Index that we introduced 2 years ago. We essentially have used the rich data that we sit on at the World Intellectual Property Organization, especially data that we have on international patent filings, to look at innovation clusters around the world. And the idea is to recognize with our ranking of 120 plus economies, we can capture innovation performance at the level of the country. But we know well that innovation performance differs and varies greatly within countries. That there are certain regions within the country, where there's lots of innovation going on, and there are others where very little innovation is going on. And also, if you look at what explains successful innovation, there are really, factors that are important at the level of country. It's, for example, how much funding goes into the science and technology system, how laws and regulations look like that determine, the overall business environment, the investment climate. But then there are also very important local factors that determine what makes for a successful innovation ecosystem. These are things like local knowledge spillovers, local labor market that sort of offer a pool of skills to companies that are really important for cutting-edge innovation. Sometimes regional policies matter as well. And what we did with the rich data we sit on is the following. So in the case of patents, we have every inventor that is listed in international patent filings, and we have the postal addresses of these inventors, and we essentially used geocoding techniques to identify the location of inventors around the world. And this is what you see in the slide here. And at the worldwide picture, you see these mountains, in North America, in Europe, and in East Asia. You also see, some activity in South America. You see very little activity in Africa. That was our first step, simply to sort of count inventors around the world and, see where they're located. And then we expanded this in the second year, and we added the authors of scientific publications. We looked at the Web of Sciences, which is the biggest collection of scientific publications. And we pretty much did the same thing. And there, for example, you would see more activity in Latin America. You see São Paulo, you see Rio de Janeiro showing up. And again, you see most of the activities in the high-income countries in North America, Europe, and East Asia. What we then did, and without going into the technical details, we combined all of these data and identified innovation hotspots around the world. We forgot about country borders and simply looked at where is innovation most dense? Where is there sort of the most dense agglomeration of inventors and authors of scientific publication? And this is sort of a bottom-up way of identifying innovation hotspots around the world. So we identified them, and then we simply counted the number of patents and scientific publications they account for, and we come up with this complementary ranking that you would find in the GII on innovation clusters around the world. Turns out, the biggest innovation cluster in the world is Tokyo, Yokohama, followed by Shenzhen, Hong Kong, Seoul, and then the Silicon Valley, Beijing. At a certain level, this is maybe not too surprising. What you see there, are the mega cities around the world, especially the really big East Asian cities, where there's, high population density, and these are also, in a sense, the biggest hotspots of innovative activity. There's only one Latin American cluster that made it in the top 100. Which is São Paulo, which again confirms the picture that I just showed you, that most of the innovation hotspots around the world are in the high-income countries in North America, Europe, and East Asia. But we're actually in the process of looking at this also in much more national contexts, that we also look at these innovation clusters relative to where a particular country stands. So this is still preliminary research that we're doing, this in the case of Brazil. Again, I'm sure this chart is much more meaningful for you than it is for me. You of course see São Paulo, you see Rio de Janeiro, you see Belo Horizonte. You see, also the kinds of cities and regions in Brazil that account for most of the gross domestic product. You see relatively, little activity in the north. But I think this kind of analysis, and this is extremely rich data we sit on there, can be very helpful in identifying, where within a country is innovation happening. And more than that, we can then identify, what is the technological focus of different clusters? Who are the biggest innovating entities? How are they linked, with clusters, other clusters within Brazil? How are they linked with other innovation hotspots around the world? So I think, this provides an important complementary, more bottom-up perspective on innovation, and is something that we'll continue to do, and I hope is something that policymakers as well as other innovation stakeholders can use in forming their view of the innovation system. This is just the same chart for scientific authors, and I'm almost out of time, so I think that's all I wanted to say. Let me thank you again for your attention, and maybe just by way of advertising, the 2019 Global Innovation Index will be published on July 24th, so stay tuned. I'm sure you'll read about it, and we look forward maybe to present the next ranking of the GI in a future edition of this Congress. Thank you very much.